Welcome back. Today we're looking at early modern Europe. And to start, I want to think for a moment about variety. This is something that's very characteristic of our modern globalized world. Think for a moment about your daily commute or just simply doing weekend or errands. How many churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, or other religious buildings would you pass between your house and your destination? Of those, how many are Christian churches and how many are Christian churches of different denominations? Think also of a simple visit to the grocery store. Today, grocers offer multiple types of fruit, but they also offer different varieties of the same fruit, sometimes from different regions of the world. Basically, our world today is diverse and it is global. And this contemporary world has origins in early modern Europe. As the region and its inhabitants emerged from the intellectual and artistic limitations of the medieval ages, explorers, priests, rulers, warriors, colonists, and slaves laid the foundation of our world as new regions opened trade and dialogue. Explorers and colonists traveling from Europe to the Americas unwittingly participated in the dramatic ecological reshaping of an entire hemisphere. Merchants carrying teas, spices, and silk from Asia to Europe to the colonies began the 500-year process of making this a truly global world. It's in this early stage of globalization, this early stage of laying the capitalist foundations of our modern system based mostly on a free enterprise system, that we want to situate American history today. Our objectives are to understand political changes within the region, to explore conflict within European Christianity at this time, and to identify these beginnings of a modern globalized and capitalist world system. So, to start, let's take a look at its medieval origins. Society in medieval Europe was largely divided into what we call three estates. And this is significant because as the United States of America progresses through the colonial ages and into the 17 and 1800s, much of Western civilization is going to radically restructure itself. It's going to throw off this idea of an organization or of a society organized around these three states into societies that are based mostly on money when it comes to societal status, as well as individual ability when it comes to how far or how low you can climb within that system. Within Europe, though, during the medieval ages, they were completely bound within this estate system. The three estates were divided amongst those who worked, those who fought, and those who prayed. Basically, the peasantry, the nobility, and the clergy. The peasantry, of course, was expected to do most of the labor and to provide most of the taxes. Their diets tended to be very basic, and they were completely under the political control of those who fought or the nobility. The nobility were the ones that usually had the land and the privilege. They were the ones that determined the law. And then finally, you had the clergy or those who prayed. They were the ones that had power and authority over the spiritual lives of the other estates. And as such, that gave them a large degree of social status as well as political power. Now, this medieval society was shaken to its foundations starting in the mid 1300s when the bubonic plague swept across Europe. Initially, this plague was carried in the stomachs of fleas that rode on the backs of rats. As humans killed these rats, the fleas jumped to them, infecting individuals. And once in the bloodstream, the disease, also known as Yersinia pestis, quickly entered the bloodstream, it entered the lungs, it became septicemic, it became pneumonic, and it was in these two variations of the disease that transmittability was radically increased. In other words, you could infect other people much easier and much faster. Also, it became a highly more lethal version of this illness. And as such, 1/3 of Europe's population died from the bubonic plague. As this plague was ravaging Europe, Europe's two powers, England and France, two of the strong powers in Western Europe, were engaged in a 100 Years' War lasting from 1337 to 1453, ravaging a large segment of Western Europe. Europe's church, the Catholic Church, was also experiencing a crisis through the Great Schism. Since the late 1300s, there had been an internal political fight over who was going to control the papacy. You had the initial pope, who wanted to reform the clergy, who was trying to be ousted by other members of the clergy because of his reformist ways. As they tried to oust them, they elected another pope whose capital, whose base of operations was established in Avignon, France. And then a third group of clergymen trying to resolve the situation decided that they wanted to elect a third pope. This great schism caused a lot of problems within Europe's highly religious society as questions began to rise over whether or not you were taking the right communion, following the legitimate priest and his chain of authority. And this was not solved until the Council of Constance from 1414 to 1418, at which point they scrapped all three popes and elected a new one. Now, at this time, the church did have a lot of controversy over some of its policies, and the church had an opportunity to reform itself. There had been many voices throughout the years, individuals such as John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, who had called for the end of certain practices that they have viewed as abusive. The Council of Constance decided to pass on this. Instead, the only thing they did in terms of reform was to hang or to condemn to death one of the leading reformers, a Bohemian by the name of Jan Hus. So all of these crises brought about serious societal changes. One thing that many Western European peasants gained was larger degrees of freedom, a little more freedom in terms of occupation and societal status through the accumulation of wealth. And some of the nobles decided to push the bounds both against the church and its control over local affairs, but also against traditional privileges, demanding, for example, certain protections against kingly powers. Now, as Europe came out of this moment of crisis in the 1300s, they entered into what was known as the Renaissance. This was an artistic and an intellectual movement that lasted from the 1350s to the 1600s, in which Europeans, finally able to access ancient texts that early Christian societies had lost or burnt, began to look back at classical Greece and Rome, the way that they organized society, the knowledge that they had, as well as their love for everything beautiful, their love for art, for architecture, for painting. And this brought about an intellectual transformation. For one, people began to view a well-educated mind as a virtue. Humanism, the study of things human as opposed to theological matters, became the main theme within universities. The liberal arts was established as the key to a truly well-rounded mind, as individuals were not only expected to learn ancient texts in different languages, but also mathematics and music. This intellectual movement was also spurred on by the new invention of the printing press that lowered the cost and made the availability of books much more open to a more general public. Now, we should not misunderstand this. Barnes & Noble was not created overnight. Books A Millions did not pop up on every street corner. Literacy was still largely limited to the wealthy, to the nobles, to the clergy, and those few peasants that could afford it. But finally, the printed word was starting to spread uh, through more than just simply the scribes that were educated in universities or the clergymen who were expected to be able to read the Bible. In addition to this, Europeans began to look back on ancient Greece and Rome and the way that they organized large urban centers. A new sense of civic pride began to find its way into many European cities and states. Rulers, princes, wealthy merchants invested in art, they invested in architecture, the reorganization, the redesign of city centers as a way to show off this sense of civic pride as well as their wealth. And in the midst of this, nobles began to question the way that they ruled their kingdoms. In the past, they depended largely on the old feudal system in which vassals gave allegiance to their lords, in this case, the nobles giving allegiance to kings, based on a contractual understanding of their relationship. The king gave them land and privilege, and in exchange, the nobles gave to the king military service and taxes. Much of this old feudal system had a series of contractual obligations that sometimes placed the obligations of one noble to multiple lords. Hence the reason why you had the kings of England, the vassals of the kings of France, but also able to claim the right to the French throne when kings died. And these were the reasons why the 100 Years' War began in the first place. In addition to this, many kings had to grudgingly accept the right of the church to collect tithes from their serfs. They had to accept the ability of Rome to have political influence over not only its subjects, but also over some of the laws they wanted to pass. A new idea of monarchy began to emerge with thinkers such as Niccolo Machiavelli, the author of The Prince. In this, instead of being these true, godly, virtuous kings, what Niccolo Machiavelli called for was a prince who basically sought power for his own ends. Niccolo Machiavelli believed that a powerful prince who looked at his government first and at virtue second was better able to guarantee peace and prosperity by ending this series of internal conflicts, of little civil wars, by increasing their own ability, their own power. Furthermore, states would start to recognize this concept of international boundaries, of state sovereignty, after the conclusion of the 30 Years' War. Ambassadors, individuals, university trained, skillful in courtly manners, would be dispatched and would have the ability to speak and to negotiate in the names of kings and queens. As Europe went through these changes, this look back to classical Greek and Rome, this turn to the humanities and liberal arts, the invention of the printing press, this development of civic pride, of new monarchs looking out for their own power above the preservation of Christendom, above the old feudal contractual ties. There was also a look outward as Europeans began to physically explore the world. Much trade used to go through the old Silk Road. The Silk Road was a series of trade networks connecting the Middle East to the Chinese empires. And as these trade networks went throughout much of Central Europe or Central Asia, they were oftentimes prey for bandits. It was a very dangerous journey, especially given some of the physical challenges of crossing this very mountainous and sometimes desertous area. Furthermore, with the Ottoman destruction of the vestiges of the Roman Empire, with their capture of Constantinople in 1453, as they expanded throughout the Middle East, they came to control this old Silk Road and its routes and its wealth. This meant that European gold for spices and silks, things that Europeans craved, were flowing to the Ottoman Empire, their vowed enemies. As the Europeans expanded their knowledge during the Renaissance, they began to look again to the sea and innovate and design new technology. Perhaps one of the greatest things that they developed at this time was a new type of a sail based off of the European dhow. The lateen sail, as it was called, was triangular in shape, and it gave European sailors an advantage over the old square sails that many of their galleys still relied on. Galleys could only flow in the direction of the wind. So if the winds were blowing from the south, this meant that they had to get out oars, they had to wait for favorable winds. What the lateen did is it allowed it to tack into the wind, and using this motion, sail up the coast of Africa. In addition to that, Europeans were enhancing their ability to map the world. Skills in cartography were increasing. And you could go to certain hot spots within Europe, such as the court of Henry the Navigator, a Portuguese who brought to his home individuals who were gifted in sail design, ship design, actually built ships, sailed these seas, had knowledge of maritime matters. And the Portuguese led these new expeditions around the world, starting with individuals like Dias and da Gama, as they slowly inched their way southward down the African coast and eventually rounding the Cape of Good Hope. Following behind this were the Spaniards. The Spaniards had finally defeated the last vestiges of the Islamic empires in southern Grenada in 1492. Coming out of this with a new Spanish empire bound together by the houses of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, they turned their attention as well to the seas, trying to find new lands and new sources of wealth. And it was in this time period that a sailor by the name of Christopher Columbus, a captain, approached them and received the court's commission, the court's patronage, to take a daring exploratory venture to the waters to the west, thinking that he could find a direct route to China, and therefore skip the old overland route of the Silk Road. In the process, Columbus was the first European to come to the Americas. As the Europeans became more and more aware that the lands to the west were not new routes to China as they falsely believed at first, they began to realize that this was an entirely new region of the globe that they had not had knowledge of. Now, initially, the Portuguese and the Spaniards argued over who had the right to settle what areas. The Europeans, believing that this was just simply another part of the Eurasian landmass, did not have a real good grasp over who had land rights, who had the right to trade in these areas and to colonize them. Since Portugal and Spain were Catholic countries, they turned to the papacy to resolve the dispute. What the Pope at the time thought that he was doing was dividing the world, giving to the Portuguese, the right to colonize Africa, since they were the first to really explore it. And what at first they believed was Asia, and later realized was a whole new region of the world, to the Spaniards, since Columbus was the first to encounter them. Little did the Pope know that he drew his line a little too far to the west. Instead, the Treaty of Tordesillas, that reorganized the world, gave to the Spaniards and those Catholic nations that still followed the papacy the right to settle what would be modern day North, Central, and South America, but he mistakenly lobbed off a tip of this. Hence the reason why today in Brazil they still speak Portuguese. Now, at the time, the Europeans were unaware of the radical ecological changes that they would bring about as a result of what we call the Columbian Exchange. This exchange of plants, animals, humans, and pathogens that began when Columbus was the first European to touch American soil since Bering Land Bridge had developed during the Wisconsin glacial episode. As a result of the Columbian Exchange, as plants and as animals changed the ecosystems of North America, as diseases such as smallpox ravaged massive portions of the Native American population, something unseen in human history would happen. As Alfred Crosby, a leading scholar on this topic, calls it, they witnessed an demographic takeover, the massive dying off of native populations to environmental changes, to disease, and to conflict, to the disruption of their societies. Left these lands depopulated, and Europeans and Africans came to repopulate these lands, bringing with them their cultures and their technologies. So this is an exciting world. Medieval Europe is ending. They're entering into the early modern age. Science and knowledge is becoming the desire of the day. Europeans are using it to explore the world around them. And at the same time, a reformation within Christianity, within Western Christianity, occurs. Prior to the coming of the early modern era, much of Christendom, those lands that Christianity dominated, was largely divided between Orthodox Christianity in Eastern lands, especially in those of Russia, of the Byzantine Empire, and Catholicism throughout Central and Western Europe, with some Coptic societies largely limited to the Middle East. Within these societies, orthodoxy was the call of the day. It was believed that a truly ordered society depended on unity not only of politics and society, but also of religious matters. In the early 1500s, a young monk from the German states of the Holy Roman Empire shattered this uniformity. Martin Luther had many questions, many doubts of his faith at the time, just as Jan Hus and John Wycliffe and other reformers before him had. The church in the 14 and 1500s had witnessed an increase in piety, but they also had some serious problems at the heart of their faith, especially in terms of its organization. The clergy was supposed to remain celibate, for example. They were not supposed to get involved in worldly affairs. Yet you had a Borgian pope on the throne at the time, Alexander VI, who seemed to have more interest in the daily goings-on of the papal states, in the court intrigues of different European powers at the time, than he had on the religious needs of his parishioners. Also, you had families that used the papacy as a way to find good jobs for younger sons who, in this older system of land tenure that depended on primogeniture, in other words, the awarding of all land to the first son and the first son only, but they viewed the church at this time as a way of getting jobs for their sons, and one way that they did this was through donations. Large donations meant the awarding of a bishopric to one of their children, sometimes children who did not lead necessarily spiritual lives. And these high-ranking officials believed that they could increase their standing, their prestige, and their worldly wealth by gaining not just one, but multiple bishoprics, some of which they never visited. In order to enhance their standing and gain an advantage in the political struggle over these lucrative awards, what some priests were doing and some bishops were using an old practice known as indulgences in a way unintended by the church. Indulgences were an old way of the Catholic Church granting the forgiveness of sins, the pardoning of offenses to Catholics who may not have access to a priest or who sometimes found themselves in extreme situations. What some of these less scrupulous bishops were doing is they were going out and promising these indulgences to individuals who donated money to the church. And this sale of indulgences was just one of many complaints that Martin Luther had against a church that he viewed as growing more and more corrupt. So in 1517, Martin Luther nailed 95 theses or protests to his church doors at Wittenberg. Initially, the church ignored the protests being issued by this young monk. However, in the Holy Roman Empire, there were a number of German princes who looked at these theses as an opportunity to engage in a new type of spiritual life that some of them desired. But for others, it was an opportunity to follow a new line of religious thinking that would limit the church's ability to involve itself in the political affairs of their kingdoms, of their principalities. And so Martin Luther's message gained popularity, both for its spiritual as well as its political significances. And then in 1521, at the Diet of Worms, the church made a fundamental decision. They basically forced Martin Luther to make a choice. Either you recant and stop issuing the theses and stop preaching some of what were viewed as heretical ideas that he held, or he faced excommunication and possibly worse. In response, Martin Luther issued his famous statement, "Here I stand, I can do no more, God help me." And with that, the Protestant movement was born, and with it, the first denomination, the Lutheran Church. Other religious figures quickly followed suit. In Switzerland, a young man by the name of John Calvin had similar ideas to those of Martin Luther. Protestants at this time believed, for example, that only the scripture, sola scriptura, was the authority that a Christian relied on for his or her salvation and for an understanding of God's desires on earth. As such, they did not believe that the many books and treaties and papal bulls that had been issued by the church over the years had any merit. They also believed that salvation came through grace alone, and that no work that human hands could accomplish on earth, for whatever reason, good or ill, could affect this destiny of damnation or salvation. Many of these young theologians also denied the idea that there should be more than two simple sacraments, the taking of communion and baptism for sins, whereas the Catholic Church still recognized other sacraments. For example, the sacrament of confirmation, one's entrance into the church body. They recognized, for example, the sacrament of confession as an essential act that sinners needed to do to come back within the graces of the church. There were also other disagreements over things such as what was happening when a Christian partook in the sacrament of the Eucharist. For the Catholic Church, they still believed in transubstantiation, that the bread and the wine, physically as well as spiritually, became the body and blood of Christ. For the Lutherans and the Calvinists, the Zwinglians and other denominations that followed, they rejected this, believing in consubstantiation, that the bread and the wine only spiritually became the blood and the body of Christ. Of all these disagreements are what led Martin Luther to break from the church. But then, once the unity of the Catholic Church had been shattered, like any piece of glass dropped on the floor, it began to fracture into more and more pieces. Behind Martin Luther, John Calvin began his own movement within Switzerland. Buried within the town of Geneva, his movement began, extending Martin Luther's ideas to embrace things such as predestination, the idea that God, being omnipotent, all-powerful, knew before humans were born their fate, had already decided from the moment of creation whether this person was saved or if they were damned to hell. As such, Calvinists believed that there was no work on earth that human beings could do. There was no guarantee of salvation, that one must lead a godly life and to just simply have faith that he or she was among what they called the elect, those few human souls that had been predestined to reach heaven. In addition to the Calvinists, you had the followers of Huldrych Zwingli in Zurich. They also began the push for their own congregations, with other emphases and other views on things such as what the service should look like for a truly godly sermon, how much of Catholicism to abandon. Among the Zwinglians and the Calvinists came the Anabaptists, individuals who refused to recognize any political power on earth, whose ideas were so antithetical to both Protestants as well as Catholics that they were hunted by the followers of John Calvin, Martin Luther, the Catholic Church, and Huldrych Zwingli. Within the Kingdom of England, Henry VIII, once a proud defender of the church and a complete and total opponent of Luther's ideas, broke from the Papal States when he began the Church of England. His break from the Church of England was largely over political power, as Rome refused to recognize his right as king to divorce his wife Catherine and to marry the young Anne Boleyn in order to guarantee a progeny, a son, to carry on the Tudor line. Initially, Henry VIII simply replaced the Pope with the King of England as the head of the throne. He made some changes, such as the decision to prohibit the practice of a cloistered clergy, the abolishment of cloistered life, and the ransacking of monasteries. But much of these were focused more on political power. And why did he focus on the monasteries? Well, as a political figure, kings needed money, and monasteries and church lands were an easy source of revenue. However, the daughters that would follow the throne behind him would make greater changes. His first daughter, Mary, would attempt a reconciliation with the church, moving the Church of England almost back to the fold of Catholicism. But her quick reign gave way to that of Elizabeth I, Elizabeth the Great, a queen who would embrace some of the Calvinist teachings within her own lands and would move the Church of England away more both in leadership and in practice from Catholicism. At the same time that this was happening, the Catholic Church itself tried to make some reform. At the Council of Trent, a long meeting of the leaders of the clergy that happened between 1545 and 1563. The church decided first and foremost that there would be no reconciliation with Protestants whatsoever, that individuals would have to choose the one true teaching, in their view, the Catholic Church, or they would be considered outside the fold of God's salvation. They did end certain abuses of Catholic teachings. For one, the sale of indulgences was hereby prohibited, and it went back to that extraordinary act that a priest could grant a follower in a situation in which the follower needed his or her last rites and did not have a priest present, for example. They also demanded that all clergymen and women, all priests, monks, and nuns, as well as deacons and other laymen of the church, became educated, truly educated in church doctrine. As such, new religious orders, such as the Jesuits, were founded with a large objective of educating the masses. Finally, the church entered into a stage that is sometimes referred to as the church militant. This was the attempt to fight heresy within Catholic lands and to expand Catholic teachings into new areas, especially those of the Americas. Much of this struggle came at the hands of these new orders, along with the charge of educating those that were within their parish. The Jesuits also had another mission, and that was to go and spread the word of the Catholic Church to other lands. And so the Jesuits, if they were not building universities at home in Europe, were oftentimes found on the edges of the known world to Europeans, living among Native Americans, for example, in converting villages. There was also the darker side of the church militant, and this is the Inquisition, the rather harsh rooting out of heretics within Catholic communities, a form of church militancy that would take a violent role in Spain, as the Spanish Inquisition used torture and executions to root out not only Protestants, but Jewish communities and Muslim communities living within Spanish lands. As this conflict over the spiritual destiny of different Europeans and later colonists around the world occurred, Protestant and Catholic lands fell into a series of holy wars. Perhaps the largest, most destructive of these wars was the 30 Years' War, which would involve a civil war within the Holy Roman Empire. But other European states, such as France, such as Sweden, would also take a role in the conflict. While the 30 Years' War left much of Central Europe in utter ruins, there were some good developments as a result of it. At the treaty that concluded the fighting, one thing that was recognized among different European states was an international legal system that recognized state boundaries as belonging to these entities. State boundaries that recognize the sovereignty of one king within his or her borders. Other conflicts, such as the French War of Religions, witnessed the tearing apart of communities as Protestants and Catholics fought amongst themselves within their own borders. In England, for example, the bitterness between Catholics and Anglicans reached an all-time high as the violence pivoted from one side to another, first under Mary and then under Elizabeth, and her descendants and her followers, such as King James I. Following Elizabeth, the kings and the queens of England completely gave their crown over to the belief of Protestantism. Thus, Protestants were viewed as the acceptable Christian faith and not Catholicism. Within the borders of the English lands, Catholics were limited in where and when and how they could worship, sometimes being taxed or even facing imprisonment if they were caught practicing their faith. But it wasn't just simply Catholics that faced this kind of treatment. There was a new social category within England, individuals known as dissenters, people that refused to follow the official teaching of the Church of England. Among these dissenters were groups of individuals known as Puritans, individuals who believed that the church was not going far enough in ridding its ceremony and its buildings and its clergy and its thinking of all things Catholics, oftentimes viewed as a thorn in the side of English leaders. And then there was the more radical group, the separatists, who believed that there was no possibility whatsoever in this world of ever truly cleansing the Church of England. That in order to save the souls of their followers, they had to completely separate themselves from the church. These dissenters, along with Catholics who they disliked and did not get along with, were oftentimes or barred from certain jobs, as well as from attending universities. In response to this, English Puritans and English Pilgrims departed from the English kingdom in the 1600s, founding colonies in Massachusetts. Catholic subjects would follow shortly behind, attempting to establish a Catholic sanctuary in the colony of Maryland. As this conflict over religion, as conflicts between European states, as attempts to root out heresy gripped different European regions, they still also had to confront plague, illness, hunger, times of economic downswing. The forces that Europe at this time period were still subject to. And as this new religious thinking was spreading, and as these religious conflicts were spreading, we were also going through a scientific revolution. Galileo was looking up at the stars and truly questioning whether or not the Earth was the center of the known universe. Francis Bacon was refining what would become known as the scientific method. Later, these scientists would be viewed as pioneers within European society, heroes, the giants upon whose shoulders individuals such as Isaac Newton and later Albert Einstein would stand. But at the time, their ideas were viewed as heretical. Nonetheless, this new way of thinking, this new way of questioning the world, blended with religious teaching. And as societies began to look for the cause of their problems, the root of all their evil, they began to suspect that there were more nefarious forces at work. They believed that the devil was prowling the earth's surface, that he had amassed a followers of witches, both male and female, and that these witches and others that were subject to his command were the ones causing hexes, were the ones causing social disunity. And so witchcraft hunts became more numerous during this time period throughout Europe, as well as in many of the American colonies. Now, one thing we recognize today is that the individuals that were oftentimes considered the suspects in these witch hunts were oftentimes outsiders. For example, Tituba, the slave that supposedly taught all of the women of Salem, was considered that outsider. Her ways, as she was a slave, who still carried much African culture uh, were viewed as suspect in the eyes of many of the Puritan leaders. Many of the young ladies condemned for witchcraft within Massachusetts oftentimes made the grave mistake of simply speaking up against male authority, questioning patriarchy. Perhaps they were outspoken. Perhaps they did things that were considered to be the purview of the man's world. And as such, they were the ones that usually fell suspect first. In addition to that, we recognize today that the leaders of these witch hunts oftentimes believed themselves to be using the most rational means of tracking down, hunting witches before they were being condemned. Books were written on how you could spot a witch, what kind of behaviors witches showed, what kind of horrific nightly deeds that they did. And oftentimes this evidence was what was brought up against witches at their trials. But much of the evidence is evidence that we would not consider for one moment to even think about in a modern day court trial. For example, looking at the records of Salem's witch trials, what they oftentimes used on, what they relied on was spectral evidence. Women being charged with the crime of witchcraft would sit in court as young women would point to the rafters saying, "There's the devil, there he is. She sends out her spirit against me. It hurt, it burns, she bites at me." And the judges and the lawyers at these trials would believe these outbursts, condemning men and women to the gallows as a result. Some communities even relied on torture as a way of getting suspects to confess, or at least to give up the names of their confederates. And as modern society knows, anybody under torture is willing to confess to just about anything if it makes the pain stop. So this world in which the American colonies would be born, was an ever-changing world in their homes of Europe. It was a world that was crawling out of the medieval ages, out of the limitations on scientific knowledge. It was a world that was opening up itself again to questions not only of a spiritual nature, but of the world around them. It was a world that was slowly learning itself as explorers set out and mapped different lands, oceans that they had not visited. And at the same time that these explorers set out into the world, they began significant fundamental changes for Native Americans that they would encounter as they brought with them new colonists, as they brought with them new species of plants and animals, and worse still, new diseases. It was a world in which Native Americans would find themselves as new items of trade were presented to them, items of trade that were greatly beneficial, yet one that would start to eat away at their traditional knowledge of survival techniques. Finally, it was a world in which one's understanding of spiritual matters was changing as well, and not changing in peaceful ways.